guys, you ready to end this act of Cyrano and find out what happens here at the end of this act? So we left off on page 459, right, when Cyrano was stalling De Guiche because Christian and Roxanne were inside getting married. So Cyrano was stalling De Guiche, making up this whole story about falling from the moon and all this other kind of thing, right? So he stalls him for 15 minutes. Then he's like, oh, time's up. And then Roxanne and Christian come walking out of the house. The priest, the Capuchin is with them, and they are now married. So De Guiche turns around and he's like, what? Who? And he looks at Roxanne and he's like, no. He looks at Christian and he's like, you? Like she married you? And so he says to Roxanne, well, my sincerest compliments. And then he says, Cyrano says to De Guiche, he says, the handsome couple that you and God have joined together. Because remember, Roxanne faked that the letter said that the priest was coming there from De Guiche to marry her and Christian, remember? And so De Guiche looks at Cyrano after he says that, and he's like, quite so. Like, in other words, he knows that that's not what his letter really said. His letter really said, wait for me, I'm coming tonight, right? And so he turns to Roxanne and he says, kindly bid your husband farewell. She's like, what? Oh no. And De Guiche is like, yes, your regiment is going to leave tonight. So report at once. And then Roxanne's like, wait a minute, what? You mean leaving tonight for the front, for the war? And De Guiche says, yep. And she's like, wait a minute, I thought that the cadets weren't going. Because remember, she had given him that idea, hey, if you want to get back at Cyrano, don't send his regiment to war. And so she's like, wait a minute, you said they weren't going. And he's like, well, now they are. And he pulls an order out of his pocket and he's like, here's the order. And they're going. So, Christian, go get your men, go get your regiment, and report back. We are leaving. And so Cyrano is like, well, come on, we gotta go because Christian's like, oh, Roxanne, give me another kiss. And Cyrano's like, all right, come on, that'll do. Let's go. Let's get going. And they're just trying to part. And he's like, oh, it's so hard to part with you. And Cyrano's like, yeah. Come on, I know. Let's go. And so De Guiche is like, let's go. So then, as Cyrano is kind of leading Christian away, like having to drag him away from his new wife, right? And so Roxanne is kind of following after them and she's like, take care of him for me and promise to never let him do anything dangerous. And Cyrano's like, well, I'll do my best, but I can't promise that. I mean, they're going to war, right? How can he promise that he's not going to do anything dangerous, right? So then she's like, well then make him be careful. And Cyrano's like, well, I'll try. Again, that's not something that he can promise. And she's like, well, make sure that you keep him dry and warm. Cyrano's like, okay, again, if it's possible. But again, I mean, this is war. He can't promise that he's going to be dry and warm all the time, right? And so then she's like, well, make sure that he stays faithful to me. And Cyrano's like, yeah, of course. And then have him write to me every single day. That's the last thing she tries to get Cyrano to promise. And notice his answer for that. He says, that I promise you. And that's where the act ends, right? With Cyrano dragging Christian off to get ready to go to war, leaving that night right after they said their wedding vows. And with Roxanne saying, please promise to have him write me every day. Cyrano says, that I will promise you. Now, why do you think Cyrano says, yeah, that I can promise? Why is it, right? Because Cyrano's the one that does the letters. And he's like, yep, I promise he can write every day. Because Cyrano is going to make sure that he writes to her every day, right? And that ends Act 3. So before you take your quiz, let's do a quick review. I'm going to ask some questions and see if you know the answers, okay? Number 1, why were a group of musicians following Cyrano around? Remember at the beginning of the act, it opened up with him coming in, this group of musicians following him. Do you remember why? Remember, it was because he had won them as a result of a bet. And so they were following him around. And remember, when he got tired of them playing for him, he didn't want them anymore. Who did he send them to play for? He sent them to play for Montfleury, right? The actor that he hated. He's like, go play for him and play out of tune also, by the way. All right. Why was Cyrano pleased by Roxanne's praise of Christian's letters? Remember when Cyrano came to visit Roxanne? And Roxanne talked about, oh, how beautiful his letters were, and they were so wonderful, and he's so poetic and everything. Why is Cyrano happy and proud of himself? Remember, because he is the one that had written the letter. So really, she's praising him, but she just doesn't know it, right? What does Roxanne ask of De Guiche when she finds out that he has been made the colonel or the head of the guards? What favor does she ask? Remember, she asked for him to leave Christian and his regiment, to leave them behind, right? That way they can get married and she doesn't have to worry about him going into battle, getting hurt, or getting killed, right? Why does Christian then finally decide, remember, Christian shows up, and why does he decide this time to speak for himself? Like, Cyrano, I don't need your help. I got this. What made him decide that? Do you remember? It's because he was now confident now that she loves him. And so he's like, I got this. I can speak for myself now. She loves me. I'm good. Well, then we have this letter, right, that comes. The Capuchin or the priest brings in this letter from De Guiche. And what does the letter tell him? Tell her for real? What does the letter really say? Remember, the letter really tells Roxanne that De Guiche is coming. He's like, I'm coming tonight, by myself. I'm going to be coming to see you tonight, right, so that they can get married. Why then does Cyrano pretend that he has fallen from the moon? Remember, he is stalling. He's trying to stall De Guiche and keep him outside for at least 15 minutes while Christian and Roxanne are getting married inside the house, right? When De Guiche has found out that he's been tricked, what does he decide to do? We just talked about that, right? He decides to send Christian and his regiment to battle that very night. Cyrano promises Roxanne that he will make Christian do what every day? What was the promise that he made? Right, that he would write to her every day. Why? Let's go back up a little bit at the balcony scene. Why was Christian speaking haltingly at the beginning of the balcony scene? Do you remember why? Remember, it's because Cyrano was giving him the words to say. He'd give him a few words at a time, and Christian would say them. Then you have to wait for Cyrano to give him a few more words and then say them. Remember? And then she was like, why are you speaking so strangely? And so then Cyrano's like, this is never going to work. So he trades places, right, with Christian. He takes his place and starts speaking to her for himself, right? Why does the Capuchin or the priest come to Roxanne's house in the first place? Do you remember why? He had come to deliver that letter to Roxanne from De Guiche. And that letter that was going to say, I'm going to come, I'm going to see you tonight, right? And I'm going to come for you tonight. And so that's what he had said in the letter for real. But remember, Roxanne made it sound like the letter said, remember, she made up and said, oh, that this is saying that I have to marry Christian. And he sent the priest here to perform the ceremony right here, right now, tonight, right? Even though that's not really what it said, but she's a little tricky so that she could get what she wanted. All right, so that's a little bit of review of Act 3. So go ahead now and take your quiz over Cyrano. And then for tomorrow, I almost forgot to mention, for tomorrow, you're going to start Act 4. You're going to read pages 463 to 470 and see what happens when they are at the battle.